Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video where I'm actually going to deal just with one little discussion point because I think it might be useful. Sometimes these comments that come up in threads are reflective of bigger ideas or more people holding these ideas, and therefore when I deal with them, it's not just being nitpicky about a commenter and here's me having a little argument with someone and I'm going to put that on a video because it's actually because I think it has some use, or at least I hope it does. Otherwise, it is just a waste of time. And I hope by bringing this up, you can look at this and say, "Oh yeah, I know someone that thinks that," and actually, okay, that's useful to be able to know something to say back to them, so on and so forth. So this comment came to on a thread on a previous video, recent video. It's from an American commenter who has commented quite a lot. I don't know whether he ever will again because he seems to be pretty fed up. I think he sits somewhere on the right of American politics. A chap called Voivodi, I think that's how you pronounce it, says, "So John, tell me this. Answer one question I'll get off your site. For 4 decades, by your own words, quote, I would rather we spend the money on education." First of all, this is a straw man of my position. Straw man is building up an idea of someone's position that they don't actually hold and then attacking that. You build up a straw man rather than a steel man, rather like a really strong version of what they believe. You build up a weak version, an incorrect version of what they believe, and knock that down and say, "Ha, I've beaten you in argument." You're like, "Yeah, but I don't actually believe that." So when I've said I would rather spend money on education, I hadn't said I would. I've said governments previously, when they've been in peacetime, have spent money on education because they have thought we would rather spend money on education than defense because we're not at war, and therefore, what's the point of spending money on defense? I've not brought myself into that at all. But anyway, he continues. That's been one of the numerous excuses over the years for Europeans' failure to at least maintain a peacetime defense. The 2% of GDP is not a level of finance at a time of war, is not the level of finance at a time of war. In my opinion, the war in Ukraine is Europe's fault for not maintaining that defense. The US should be an ally of last resort, not your go-to guy as you screw us in world trade. 350 Americans paying for the defense of 500 million Europeans. Then you want to play the moral card? It's all free? Okay, right, loads to unpack here. So this is the idea. Well, first of all, he very clearly says the war in Ukraine is Europe's fault. That is a massive problem. It's not just Europe's fault, it's Europe's fault for not maintaining that defense budget. So what's he talking about? Well, the kind of NATO agreement is you spend 2% your budget on defense. So if we have a look at defense spending, so America spends $800 billion on defense, and that is about the same as the next 9 countries combined. There's some calculation says the next 70 countries combined. Depends where you take this and how you calculate it, but just to give you some idea of how much money the Americans spend on defense, there is your answer. But interestingly, they have kicked up spending more. They spend themselves the as a share of GDP, how much product they generate, how much kind of money's kicking around their economy in any given year. They are spending the least at the moment that they have done for a long time, or at least they have been recently. It's just ticking up now in this time of war, but it ticked up at around 2001. What happened there? Well, uh, World Trade Center. So this idea is when you don't have wars, you spend less on defense. I mean, America have shown that there. So it's not just a European problem, that is an American problem. But you've had kind of NATO and NATO expenditure, and you have this 2% line where America spent loads more on defense than other NATO countries have as a percent of their GDP. So 2%, so not the budget, 2% of GDP. So US has spent more. Trump came along and said, "Hey, we're spending too much money," and there was definitely a point there. He's saying, "I want to get out of NATO. It's obsolete, and we're spending too much money on it." And that was all really controversial. And luckily, they didn't because NATO's been pretty important. But let's go back to this idea of it's Europe's fault for not maintaining that defense, for not spending that much money. So the war in Ukraine is Europe's fault for not spending enough money. That's like saying there are some vandals coming around the neighborhood, right? They have smashed up your house. It's your fault they smashed up your house because you made your house out of wood. You know, they burnt your house down. It's your fault you made it out of wood. No, it's their fault for burning the house down. So talking about causality, and I've talked about causality before, and it's really, really complicated. There's something called Inus conditions for causality. J.L. Mackie, the philosopher, talked about this. Inus conditions are insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. So what this means is basically if you had a fire in your house, right, and the gas was going, the gas got left on, and you came back home and you switched your lights on and that blew up the house. Uh, you could what caused the house to blow up? Was it you switching the light? Well, that was necessary. You needed to switch the light, but then you needed but the light needed to be switched on, but the gas needed to be left off, and then the gas needed to be go out into the room. But you take away one of those things, and it wouldn't have happened. So, what caused the fire? Was it the gas being left on? Was it you switching the light on? Blah 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 blah. And causality is really really difficult to work out. And it's just saying it's one thing is never ever, especially in geopolitics, is never ever going to work, right? There are going to be all these things coming together, and each one of them, if it wasn't there, might have caused that thing not to happen, or still might have happened. And trying to work out what was a necessary component of causality is just really, really difficult, especially when to test that, you have to go back in history. So, the idea that it's Europe's fault for not spending that much money is to forget that Russia involved in that. But what's really important to remember here, and it's this idea that America have come in and saved the day, but it's Europe's fault, and America just saving the day. Um, is this idea that the Cold War and the arms race was this race between the US and the Soviet Union? And you could arguably say predominantly those two, right? There were allies involved in, being allied to the US and technologically aligned with them and so on and so forth. But really, in simplistic terms, you got the US and Russia. And when you've got this arms race that goes on like this, and you have NATO that's on one side of that arms race, it's an interesting thing to say. Uh, you guys aren't spending enough money on this. It's like, yeah, but you're the ones that are going through this arms race, pushing us up and up and up and escalating this thing. That's your deal, and you're now saying we have to come along and so yeah. But then NATO was we had agreement. There's 2% needs to be spent on GDP. Yeah, but you're the one that's escalating this and etc. etc. So uh, it's complicated, right? Trying to work out why things happen is complicated, and trying to say that we don't do enough is further complicated by the fact that you are arguably provoking things with Russia over time, or the Soviet Union over time. And then, of course, you need to look at Soviet Union's part to play in this, obviously. I just think it's really problematic to say it's Europe's fault for not spending enough money when we've not been at war, we haven't had the need. So, what do you do in those situations? And there's been this escalation, which hasn't necessarily been, motivated or inspired by those European nations themselves. Anyway, just a few more points, and I'm going to come back to speak about that in more depth. I think most people, certainly myself, when we voted for Trump, had doubts whether he could be presidential. But we knew on NATO he would be on you like a bulldog on a fat lady's rear. Now, highly controversial. I could bet you £1,000,000 he would not have voted for Trump because of his position on NATO. Anyway, that was needed. If he would have been re-elected, chances are very good there would be no war in Ukraine for now, as a letter of the US resignation from NATO would have been submitted. Chances are this whole if Trump was ruling, was president, this wouldn't have happened. I completely refute, but I'm not going to go into depth on that. But had the US come out of NATO, then of course he would have, had NATO been in disarray, given resignation letters, that would have been a perfect time for him, for Putin to have been opportunistic there. So yeah, I just don't think that's the case. Putin would have waited. Europe has sucked us into a war we didn't want 3 times in the last century. Right. I'm going to go back to this escalation thing. So we've been sucked into this war by Europe. So this war that's a result of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, and in fact, the Soviet Union wants Ukraine as a buffer zone because of the US escalation with, and the history of NATO since 1949. Like, to think that US isn't part of this is incredibly problematic. And let's draw Voivode to a bit of history here and a bit of understanding of what's going on in Russia. So you have the Primakov Doctrine. What is the Primakov Doctrine? It's a Russian political doctrine formulated in the 1990s, right? It assumes that the national security of the Russian Federation relies on its superpower status, and therefore Russia cannot allow the formation of a unipolar international order led by the United States, right? So, although you might say the Primakov Doctrine is no longer like the prima doctrine of Russia, it is still there, and it is largely responsible for where Russia is now. Um, for this guy to say that the US has been sucked into a war in Ukraine, when one of the people involved in this war is Russia, who has this idea that you cannot have a world where the US is a superpower. That's largely why they're having these imperialistic um, intentions on Ukraine. Right? It's all about the US. Don't come to us and say this is a European war. You've got us sucked into this, without understanding what Russia's motivations are. Like, and understanding that America has a huge, huge part to play in this. Like, possibly the biggest part to play in this, bigger than European nations, bigger than Greece, bigger than Italy, right? The US has a far, so you can go back. Of course, you can go back to these charts and say you guys aren't paying enough, and that is a valid thing. But actually, to say that this is our fault for this war, this Ukrainian war is our fault, and not looking at Ukraine, not looking at Russia, not looking at America in this, is just really, really naive. Arguably, America has triple, quadruple, quintuple the responsibility of this war than Canada or Italy, for example. Uh, so if you want to look at responsibility, versus percentage of GDP that people are contributing to NATO budgets, is really problematic. Now, I'm not demonizing the US here, not at all. I'm fully on the side of the US, and I actually absolutely want them as an ally, but and to be playing the major part in this, in the resolution of this conflict. So I'm not demonizing the US in any way here. He says, but I am going to say something. So Europe has sucked us into a war we didn't want 3 times in the last century. Your justification is we're a rich country and we can afford it. I mean, you are super, super rich. There's no doubt about it. At least we know the quality of our friends. So my question is, why do you ask for our funding, equipment, blood, and treasure if we are an ignorant people in European opinion? I, I don't know. I've not called you an ignorant people. There are ignorant people in America, just as well there are ignorant people in the UK and every other country. So again, straw man. Treasure, don't know what you mean there. Okay, funding and equipment, yes, I would like that, because I think that without it, Ukraine is screwed. But also, it's in the US's best interest, and US has some responsibility to play in the development of the Cold War and where the Soviet Union are. So it's really difficult to unpick all these things, and this is geopolitics over the last 70 years plus. But I think it's in the best interest that the US do this and do provide the funding and equipment alongside of all the other allies, of course. And as for him saying blood, there's no US blood being spilled apart from a few volunteers. Okay, so just again, straw man, just not correct. So I'm going to forget those parts. But he goes on to say, let me put it this way from a hardworking American point of view. You call us rich, that's a very small proportion of the people who pay for you. I'm not cherry picking, as you like to put it. Most of us are not interested in ruling anyone. Actually, history supports this. You can't say that. A large number of issues we somehow got involved with were directly influenced by European collapsed monarchies, so on and so forth. Um, and it's like, man, you probably need to have a little look at how America has been over the last 70 years. So since 1949, like United States involvement in regime change, here's just a wiki page that's quite useful. Go and watch something like The War on Democracy by John Pilger. It's good 15-year-old documentary now, but it talks about how was it something like 17 democratically elected governments in South America that the US has got involved in the regime change. So don't come around saying you're all like this is all Europeans and we're not interested in ruling anyone. Yeah, you might not be interested in ruling anyone, but you're interested in changing governments to align with your ideology, whether that be economic, political, or whatever. I'm not saying that the British, goodness me, like this sounds like I'm demonizing America here, but I'm just like this is a bit of history, and uh, the UK doesn't have a particularly clean history in terms of imperialistic ideals. But there you go. So the countries that the US have been involved in regime change since the Cold War began in 1945 up to 1991 alone is very long, right? There is a very long list of countries that the US has been interested in changing the rulership of. Uh, that shouldn't be controversial. I mean, but the idea that we're not interested in ruling anyone, we just want to sit over here in America, not be involved. You sort out your own problems, you sort out your own wars. You are involved in so many things around the world. The least of one of which is Ukraine, right? So I wrote an article back at the beginning of the war, the outbreak of the war. I was like, is the Russia-Ukraine conflict quite so clear-cut? Well, I tried to take a really objective position on the war and say, and I was looking at one particular article that basically blamed the US. So here there are positions where the US hold squarely at fault for the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war. I was like, yeah, I'm not happy with that approach, but the US was involved as lots of countries were, and one way it was involved was with McCain and Newland and other politicians. I'm just trying to find the part in here where I talk about it. Let's go and do let's find where I've mentioned Newland. Here, down here. So yeah, so you've got Newland, you've got the IMF, you've got McCain, you've got all sorts of American involvement in the Euromaidan protests. I mean, the Russian narrative is that it was the Americans that was basically caused that protest to happen. It was like a proxy protest type thing. And I would never go that far. But there was US involvement back in 2014. And this idea that this is Europe's war, when Ukraine's not even in Europe, right? It's not even in the EU, is just hugely, hugely problematic, right? America are deeply, deeply involved with geopolitics all around the world, and they're deeply involved with Ukraine. The EU is deeply involved with Ukraine. This is a world war, as in this war has global reach. It's not a world war, as in there are two armies fighting, but there's a good reason that the US is putting all of that money, funding, and equipment into this war, as well as the EU, as well as allies of Ukraine. And there's a good reason there are lots of countries allied with Ukraine because there's a lot on the line here. And you can walk away and say it's not our problem, but that will come back and bite you on the arse, US, when you understand where Russia stands with regard to how it sees the world as some kind of uh, place where it's either our influence or the US's, and it can't be the US's because we can't. It has to be unipolar. They can't be multifaceted. Power structures based in the real world, and okay, we might take China on board with us, but you know that they're going to help us have it will be as one, if you like, and BRICS and so on and so forth. But it can't be the Americans. And if you understand Russia's motivations like that, there's a good reason that all that money that has been ga- gained from their hydrocarbons and fossil fuels and natural resources for the last 50 years and since the 90s has gone into people's pockets. But that's about power, in that case individual power or power for the country in terms of reserves, building up currency reserves and whatnot. Where hasn't it gone? It hasn't gone on the welfare state in Russia. It hasn't gone on the education system in Russia. Why not? You need to understand what Russia's intentions are. Russia's intentions are for power. They're not really for making their country a better place for the people that live there, who live there. So they are seeing things in a very simple nature, I guess, which is it's our power or it's a US power. So for us, Ukraine is in some way allowing us to regain power that was lost since the 90s, harking back to this kind of imperialistic, um, oddly imperialistic or Soviet Union imperialistic time. But of course, you know, it's funny when you look at and Perrin's recent video talks about this, where you've got real nationalists in Russia are harking back to the golden era of both Soviet Union and Tsarism, where you like those two are ideologically opposed. So what are they really interested in? Well, when Russia had power. So what this harking back to times and eras when Russia was powerful. So it's not about communism, it's not about monarchism, it's about imperialistic power. So I think, you know, this is just a long ramble, obviously, and you know, take it or leave it. But I I get a little bit annoyed in with views like this saying, well, we shouldn't be involved in this. This is Europe's problem when it's not. It's an American problem and a European problem and a global problem, because either you're going to have some kind of imperialistic world order with an axis between Russia, China, Iran, and so on and so forth, or you're not, right? And America is deeply, deeply involved in the not part there, uh, for their own benefit. It's not them coming along knights in shining armor like they saw in like this guy sees them doing in World War One and World War Two. That's a calculation of like what's the world that what do we want the world to look like for our benefit, for the US's benefit, our being people in the US. Um, but this is not the America getting sucked into a war by the Europeans, like as if this is our war. And like this is Ukraine's war with Russia, but it's in our best interest that Ukraine prevail, and it's in the US's best interest that Ukraine prevail. So we need to work together. This kind of divisiveness is completely uh, unhelpful. And you know, I could go on about things that he says, which is just utterly insanely wrong. Like stuff like if you research Churchill in the 20s, he was not the author of It's Your Finest Hour. He was a real bastard when it comes to the Arabs. Learn your history before you point fingers at others. I've never mentioned Churchill. And if you want my opinion on Churchill, you'll be very surprised it's not as shining as you think it might be. And I could talk to you about famines in India and about how Churchill's implicit racism um, was a large component in that. So don't straw man me. Please don't straw man me. But that's me getting a bit of personal on this argument as opposed to dealing with these more general and useful ideas for you. Um, yeah. This is complicated. Causality is complicated, and if anyone ever tells you one thing caused another thing, especially when it's in terms of geopolitics, they're almost always wrong. Causality is a matrix, like the entire universe at one point causes the entire universe at the next point. Let's try and map that back and try and make sense of that, given all of these variables going on, and try and kind of be a bit simplistic to say, well, largely that was a huge causal variable in that, but there's going to be that and that and that, and these things working together, and that causes, hey, a war in Ukraine. It's not like Europe. Europe's lack of funding their defenses caused the war in Ukraine. Putin, anyone? Cold War? Ukraine? Oh no, it's Europe's fault. Okay, fair enough. Anyway, that's my ramble. Ramble over. I'm going to ramble on. No, don't start singing Led Zeppelin. Anyway, thank you for your support. I hope that was in some way interesting. If not, bad luck. Take care. Speak to you soon.